Okay, picture the scene. It's Friday the 13th, February 2026. You're in Munich, inside the Bayerischer Hof Hotel.
Right.
And this is, it's arguably the most exclusive high-stakes gathering on the entire planet. You've got defense ministers, you have spies, heads of state, the people who, actually have their fingers on the buttons all packed into these gilded conference rooms. The champagne is perfectly chilled, the suits cost more than my car, but the mood is absolutely freezing.
It really is. It's the premier event for the global defense elite. And, usually it's where the polite veneer of diplomacy tries to smooth over all the cracks. But this year, the cracks are turning into canyons. The tension in the hallways is just, you can feel it.
And we are diving straight into that tension today. I've been combing through this massive stack of reports, transcripts, diplomatic cables from the 60-second Munich Security Conference. And let me tell you, there is a narrative here that feels less like a policy briefing and, well, more like a geopolitical detective story. We're looking for a tipping point in a war that feels completely stuck in the mud.
That is the perfect way to frame it. Everyone arrived in Munich looking for a way out of the Ukraine conflict, which has just been grinding on and on and on.
And here's where the plot thickens. The United States delegation, led by the envoy to NATO, Matthew Whitaker, he dropped a bombshell. He stood up and essentially redrew the map of the war. He's claiming that the key to ending this thing, to finally stopping the fighting, it isn't in Moscow. And it's not in Kyiv, it's in Beijing.
It's a fascinating pivot, and it really shifts the entire frame of the conversation. Usually we view this as a European crisis or a direct standoff between NATO and Russia. But Whitaker is suggesting that the road to peace runs directly through China.
So our mission for this deep dive is to figure out if that's actually true or if it's just, wishful thinking. We're going to unpack why the U.S. believes China holds the kill switch for this war. We need to look at the specific evidence they laid out. We're going to follow the money and the microchips, and then we have to talk about the absolute drama happening between the U.S. and its European allies. Because, spoiler alert, while they're pointing fingers at China, they are also at each other's throats.
Which is a dangerous distraction when you're trying to project strength. But, okay, let's start with that central claim, the Beijing leverage.
Okay, let's dig in. Ambassador Whitaker takes the stage. He calls out aggressive Russia and China as the top security challenges. But he links them in a way that feels different this time. He says China has significant leverage.
Right. And leverage is the polite diplomatic word for power. Whitaker's argument, which, reflects the Trump administration's position here, is that China isn't just a bystander watching from the sidelines. He's calling them a tipping point. The theory is that if Beijing decided tomorrow that the war needed to end, they could force Vladimir Putin to the table.
Okay, pause there for a second, because there's a quote here that made me do a double take. It wasn't just Whitaker. We have the Finnish president, Alexander Stubb, weighing in with something he said back in 2024 that is being referenced again now. He said that a phone call from President Xi Jinping would resolve this crisis. One phone call. That sounds a bit reductive, doesn't it? We're talking about a massive, complex war. Is Stubb being serious, or is this just diplomatic hyperbole?
Well, it's a bit of both, but don't dismiss it too quickly. Stubb isn't talking about magical persuasion. He's not suggesting Xi calls Putin and appeals to his good nature. He's talking about leverage in the sense of survival. Think about it like a corporate merger. If your biggest investor, the guy paying the electric bill and covering payroll, calls you and says, shut it down, you don't really have a choice.
So it's about the money.
It's about cold, hard economics. Since the Western sanctions hit Russia, the Kremlin has had to pivot its entire economy east. They've been cut off from Western markets, Western banks, Western tech. China has become the lifeline.
So without that lifeline, the argument goes, the Russian war machine just runs out of gas.
Literally and figuratively. And Whitaker wasn't shy about the details. He didn't just say China is helping. He brought receipts. He accused China of effectively subsidizing the war.
Let's break that subsidy down. The first part is obviously energy.
Yes. Whitaker pointed out that China is purchasing massive amounts of Russian oil and gas. When Europe stopped buying, China stepped in. By buying that energy, they are keeping the Russian state solvent. They were keeping the lights on in Moscow and the soldiers paid on the front lines. That's the cash part of the subsidy.
But here is where it gets really interesting to me. It's not just about barrels of oil. It's about the hardware. The source material keeps talking about dual-use technologies.
Yeah.
Now, for you listening, that sounds like a dry, bureaucratic term you'd skim over in a contract. But when you look at what's actually on the list, it's kind of terrifying.
This is where the detective work gets really difficult for the West. Dual use is a nightmare for regulators. We aren't talking about China shipping tanks with red flags on them. We are talking about things like a microchip that is designed to run a smart washing machine in Shanghai, or maybe a sensor for a commercial camera, legitimate civilian stuff. But with a little tweaking, that same chip ends up guiding a cruise missile into a power plant in Kharkiv.
So it's plausible deniability built right into the hardware.
Exactly. Whitaker's report lists semiconductors, drone components, electronic jamming gear. These are the nervous system of modern warfare. A modern missile, a surveillance drone, an electronic warfare system, they all run on semiconductors.
And Russia can't make these themselves.
That's the key insight. Russia lost access to high-end Western tech. They don't have the domestic capacity to build these advanced nervous systems. So without these specific Chinese components, the Russian war machine doesn't just slow down, parts of it essentially go blind.
So when we see a drone strike in the Donbass, there's a very high probability that the brain inside that drone came from a factory in Shenzhen.
That is the allegation. And that's why Whitaker said, and I'm quoting here, the Chinese are buying too much Russian oil and gas right now. They're giving the Russians too much dual-use technology to continue this war.
And his demand was pretty blunt, too. He said China needs to stop sitting on the fence and join the United States and our other allies in pressuring Russia. Which, let's be honest, feels like a tall order given the current state of U.S.-China relations.
It is a massive ask. But it highlights the U.S. strategy. They're trying to frame China as a co-belligerent, or at least a critical enabler. They want to increase the diplomatic cost for Beijing.
Okay, so let me try to map this out. The U.S. has this grand theory. Squeeze China, China squeezes Russia, the war ends. It sounds logical on paper. But meanwhile, back on the actual ground in Europe, what is happening? Because the sources say peace talks are, well, stalled. Seems like a polite way of putting it.
Stalled implies a pause, like we're just waiting for a green light. This feels more like a gridlock where both cars have crashed and the engines are on fire. The Munich conference is happening against a backdrop of completely failed negotiations. We have reports that the U.S., Russia, and Ukraine have been talking, but they're just hitting a brick wall.
And looking at the details, it's the classic immovable object problem. It's about territory, right?
It almost always starts with territory. Russia is insisting on controlling the entire Donbass region. And we aren't just talking about where the troops are sitting today. In some cases, they want administrative control over land they haven't even fully conquered yet.
Which has to be a non-starter for Kiev. I mean, I can't imagine any Ukrainian leader surviving politically if they agree to give up land they still hold.
It would be political suicide. But the flip side is even harder to solve. Security guarantees. Ukraine is saying, fine, even if we stop shooting, what prevents you from attacking us again in 6 months or 2 years?
And history suggests that is a very, very valid fear.
Right. So Ukraine wants NATO-style guarantees, essentially Western boots on the ground or a binding Article 5 commitment that says if they hit us, you hit them. But Russia says absolutely not. Western troops on our border is the reason we claim we started this war.
So they're locked in a room where the exit door for one person is the trap door for the other.
That's a great way to put it. And even where there seems to be progress, it's a bit of a mirage. The European officials mentioned that they've agreed on definitions like, this is what a ceasefire looks like, or this is what a demilitarized zone looks like.
That's like agreeing on the rules of monopoly, but refusing to actually open the board game.
Precisely. And the voices from the room reflect that deep frustration. You have Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky there in Munich. He's not asking for definitions or dictionaries. He's asking for air defense. He's asking for arms commitments.
He needs ammo, not a glossary.
Exactly. And then you have the Latvian foreign minister, Baiba Braje. She told Politico there is not a single indication that Russia is taking peace talks seriously. So despite the whole China leverage theory we just talked about, the reality on the ground is grim.
So you have a stalled war, a frustrated Ukraine, and a U.S. delegation pointing fingers at China as the only solution. But, and here's the twist that really makes this a Munich standoff, the U.S. delegation wasn't just pointing fingers at Beijing, they were pointing them right at their own friends. This is the part of the source material that made me physically cringe a little.
The transatlantic tension. It was the elephant in the room.
Ambassador Whitaker used a metaphor that, but let's just say it wasn't subtle. He was talking about burden sharing, about Europe paying for its own defense. And he compared Europe's dependence on the U.S. to children.
Yes. He compared them to children who eventually need to get a job.
Whoa, wait, get a job. He actually used those words. in a room full of heads of state and diplomats.
He did. It's the diplomatic equivalent of flipping the table at a dinner party.
I mean, I could just imagine the silence in the room after that line. That is not the standard "we value our partners" speech we're used to hearing.
Far from it. And you have to look at who he's talking to. These are allies like Germany and France who have been structuring their entire defense policy around U.S. support for 70 years. Whitaker is effectively telling them the free ride is over, and he's not being polite about it. He's framing the alliance as transactional.
And the Europeans didn't just take it sitting down, did they? We have this counterpunch from German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, and wow, he didn't hold back either.
No, he did not. Merz stood up and declared that the United States leadership has been challenged and possibly lost.
Possibly lost. That is a heavy statement coming from Germany, one of America's closest allies. That sounds like more than just a snappy comeback.
It is. It reflects a deep anxiety in Europe. Merz is urging President Trump to repair transatlantic relations, not just for sentimental reasons, but because he sees a combined threat. He's saying, essentially, we have Russia on one side, China on the other. We cannot afford to be fighting each other.
And that leads to the key contradiction in this whole deep dive. If we connect the China strategy to this European fight, it just doesn't add up. Can the West effectively pressure China if the U.S. is telling Europe to get a job and Germany is saying U.S. leadership is lost?
That is the trillion-dollar question. Chancellor Merz's comeback isn't just an insult, it's a diagnosis of weakness. If Beijing looks at Munich and sees a fractured alliance, does that pressure we talked about earlier, the leverage, even work? A divided West is much easier to ignore than a united one.
Right. If I'm Xi Jinping, why would I pick up the phone and cut off my Russian ally just because a group of people who are fighting amongst themselves told me to?
Exactly. If Whitaker wants China to join the U.S. and allies, those allies need to be on the same page. Right now, they seem to be reading from entirely different books.
It's a mess. A high-stakes, incredibly expensive mess. So let's try to synthesize this complex web we've just walked through. What are the big takeaways here?
Well, we have a three-way standoff. First, the U.S. has identified a clear lever to end the war: China. They are arguing that through economic subsidies and dual-use tech, those microchips and drone parts, China is keeping Russia in the fight.
But at the same time, the peace talks are deadlocked over territory and security. Russia won't move on the Donbass, and Ukraine won't move without safety guarantees.
And finally, while the U.S. is trying to rally pressure on China to break that deadlock, they are simultaneously hammering their own European allies to pay up, causing massive friction within NATO itself.
For you, the listener, I think the big aha moment is realizing how much modern warfare has changed. It's not just about who has the most tanks or the bravest soldiers. It's about semiconductor supply chains. It's about energy markets. It's about whether a factory in Shenzhen ships a box of chips to a factory in Moscow.
Absolutely. The battlefield is global now. A decision made in an office in Beijing regarding export licenses has direct consequences for a soldier in a trench in eastern Ukraine.
And that brings us to a final, somewhat provocative thought. We started with the idea that the U.S. believes China holds the key to peace. Whitaker says they are the tipping point. But if that's true...
If that's true, it raises a very uncomfortable question for NATO. If the U.S. and Europe are publicly admitting that they cannot end this war without Beijing's help, have they effectively admitted that they cannot win it on their own?
That is the thought that sticks with me. And if they need China to make that phone call, if they need Xi Jinping to step in and save the day, what's the price tag? Beijing isn't going to do that for free. What does China ask for in return? That is the question that should keep us all up at night.
And one I suspect we won't have the answer to for a long time. But we'll be watching.
On that cheery note, we're going to wrap up this deep dive. Thanks for listening, and remember, read between the lines.
Stay curious.
See you next time.